This is Jewish Spotlight, a weekly television program presented by Chabad Lubavitch of Long Island, featuring various aspects of modern Jewish life and Jewish culture. Now, here is your host, Rabbi Tuvia Teldin.
Spotlight about the situation in Israel. It's a situation which bothers and affects the lives of so many of us. And it's constantly on the mind of so many of not only American Jewry, but Jewry around the world and all of humanity, because it's literally the center of the universe as far as the potential for, God forbid, terrible things that are happening and could happen in the future in our world. And so the eyes of the world are in Israel. And as Americans, we look at what the Israelis are going through, the pain and the suffering, the daily getting up and not knowing from day to day what's going to be with your family, if you can get on a bus, if you can go out for pizza. A fear that must be just so hard for us to truly understand. And in speaking to Israelis and in seeing the situation, I wanted to be able to find a way to share with our audience what is going through the mind and the hearts and the feelings of Israelis living in Israel today. And then I came across this book. The book is called Letters to America by Michael Stern. It's a book which really expresses the feelings of how Israelis live from day to day. And I think it's an important message, and I think it's a message that you need to hear, because you need to know what is really going on there. Forget about the politics, forget about all the governmental announcements and all the things we read in the newspapers from the day to day. What's happening in the kishkes, in the guts of each Israeli who wakes up in the morning and looks forward to a day not knowing if they're going to be able to live through it. So I want to welcome Michael Stern for being on the show. And I want to congratulate you on writing this book and on putting it together and making sure that it gets out to the public. And I wish you success in doing it. Can you tell us a little bit about what motivated you to write this book?
Okay. Well, living in Israel is a unique experience. And when the Intifada started, the second Intifada, I realized first and foremost that of all the events that were happening on a daily basis in Israel and in the Middle East, only a small percentage of that actually got to the newsrooms of CNN or BBC, and very, very little of it got to an American audience.
What do you mean by that? It could be good. When we hear the news, we're trusting the journalists, we're trusting the fact that they are bringing the news as best as possible. What aspect of the news was not getting to the public?
Okay. Example of many, many cases during the course of a week, there might be one or two, God forbid, major bus bombings, and they would be covered by all the major networks, and you would see that covered. And there would be, I don't want to get into the bias or not bias of the coverage, but it would be information available all over the world. The day before that, the day after that, there would be drive-by shootings, kidnappings, attacks that were foiled, attacks that weren't foiled, many, many stories, literally in the hundreds, that were not reported and became only known to the people who either live in Israel or live in one of the surrounding countries.
Now I understand what you're saying, because I've heard from many sources that the amount of incidences averages perhaps 7 to 10 terrorist acts every single day.
Yes.
And that we're only getting the major events which are newsworthy and which are catching the headlines.
Right.
This is what you're referring to.
Exactly.
But these are things that from the Israeli perspective, each Israeli lives with that and hears it and reads about the news or hears it on the radio every hour and a half. There's been another attack in the south, another attack in the west, another attack in the east.
That's right. That's right. One of the letters that I wrote, these letters to America were originally email letters to various Americans that I knew from the time I grew up and was raised and educated in America before I moved to Israel, and relatives, friends, and many, many friends and recommendations to send them emails each week.
Because they want to know also.
They want to know what was going on.
From the inside out.
Exactly. And they were telling me that we didn't hear about this thing and we didn't hear about that, and many, many times there'd be stories that completely bypassed the news, especially if in the end the casualty count was either minor injuries or not particularly a very low count of injured or dead. It would not make the news whatsoever.
Now, before we get to some of the specifics of the book, I want to just go through the transformation of the Israeli psyche over the course of the years of the Intifada. How, in a certain way, it's worn down many people. People who feel that they just can't do this anymore. They want to go to America. They want to leave Israel. In some ways, it's increased the level of bitachon, the level of faith that people have in God Almighty, and realizing that their life is in God's hands from day to day. It's also, I think, politically turned the country to a great degree, as it has affected many people, many Jewish people, many non-Jewish people here in the States as well, as far as going further to the right politically, as far as realizing that as much as we want peace, it's foolish to be setting up an Oslo, and it's foolish to be setting up a Madrid conference and setting up all these other types of peace efforts, when really it's an exercise in futility until we have a partner in peace who can really talk tachlis, talk business. So can you comment on these transformations? Because these are major transformations that society has gone through in a very short period of time.
Correct. I think the difference, for example, between Intifada 1, which was in the early 90s and starting in the 80s, which ended essentially with the beginning of the Oslo Agreement. That uprising, as it was called, was a rock-throwing, not particularly violent in terms of casualties, demonstration by Palestinians that they were resisting of Israelis, they call it occupation, but Israeli soldiers maintaining security in the area. But there was a very low amount of death on both sides, and most of the Israeli society hoped that there would be some resolution to that could be done either on a political basis or some basis, so that it wouldn't escalate into ever a war between Palestinians and local Arabs.
Oslo was at the time had the appearance of being a solution.
Exactly, and I would say that a majority, I can't quote numbers exactly, but a majority of Israel supported that process as its beginning. There were various camps that were opposed to it, both philosophically and from lessons of history, and said that it wouldn't work. And one of those reasons is that the Arab-Israeli conflict up to that point had been tried to push away to the borders, and wars were fought up until the '67 war, and then beyond that, Israeli soldiers being called up to reserve and then fighting in areas that were not part of Israel. But the Intifada changed all that and brought the violence to the heart of Israel.
Right.
And what Intifada 2 has done by arming the Palestinian Authority, by giving them weapons, by giving them a police force, which was intended to monitor their own areas, we've created an army being led by terrorists, and that army is free to support terrorism, to inflict terrorism anywhere it wishes to go.
And it's been almost as clear as black and white. I mean, I don't think anybody really is arguing with that, and that's why the Israeli left has received a tremendous blow to its efforts, because it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize what's going on here.
Yeah, and I think what will come out, if it hasn't already come out in the mass media, is that many casualties that American army is suffering in Iraq is not due to Iraqis, but is due to foreign soldiers, which is probably a euphemism for Palestinians that have been sent through Syria into Iraq to conduct further terrorism.
Okay.
And this is probably something that will be coming out.
Interesting. Well, let's get to the book. I had an enjoyable time reading the book. I was, I don't know if enjoyable is the right word, but it was very interesting to see some of the different perspectives that you were able to relate to it. Living with Terror and Homicide Bombers in the Middle East. This is a very scary title, because for most of us, the idea of living with terrorism is something that we can't relate to. We saw it, we experienced it in 9/11, we experienced that unbelievable sense of vulnerability, of victimization, of helplessness at 9/11 and for the weeks after 9/11. And I read your selection before and after 9/11. How do you compare and contrast this sense of living with terror that you feel being an Israeli living in Israel, as opposed to perhaps the feeling of living with terror that we feel and felt post 9/11?
Right. First and foremost, I have to say that 9/11 was a terrible tragedy that brought home to many Americans what it's like to feel the results of a terror attack.
No question
The
about it.
randomness, the fact that
The total
it
wanton
doesn't
treating
discriminate.
of life.
Right. And the fact that victims could be of any race, religion, age. There's no discrimination. There's no targeting of a military purpose, or there's no targeting of a political purpose. It's violence for violence sake, in a sense.
Yes.
That, I think, was never made clear until 9/11 here in America.
Unfortunately.
Now, if you can translate that kind of incident to Israel, where effectively that incident is repeated week after week after week after week.
Literally day after
And
day.
day after day, but in numbers, every week there's like another 9/11 somewhere during the week where there are casualties.
I think that
percentage-wise.
Percentage-wise, you mean in terms of the percentage of Israelis that are affected by the Intifada?
Exactly. That each week in Israel, more and more people and more places are added to the victims list.
Right.
And the percentage today is such that everybody either knows someone, or knows a family, or a friend, or a neighbor, or someone who's
Right.
been victimized,
Anybody in the
now
country.
multiple times. Some
Right.
people have been in 3 or 4 different attacks.
Right.
And it's a horrible thing. Things
So
that we
how
take
do
for
mothers
granted.
and fathers live with that? How do you put your children on a school bus in the morning? How do
Well.
people go about their daily routine? I mean, people just totally resign themselves to the fact that my life is not in my hands and I have to surrender to God's will or to fate or to however a person might look at it. I mean, this must be a topic of
Yes.
conversation that
Yes.
Israelis talk about on
Yes.
a daily basis.
Yes. Well, not so much. Mitzav, the situation, it's called Mitzav in Israel, is always there. Every individual, if you had time for 1 million interviews, you would get 1 million different stories. And each family is different and each person's different on how they cope with what you're saying. There are people who won't go on a bus for whatever, because of the violence that occurs on buses. My secretary drives to and from Hadera, or goes on a bus every day, and doesn't feel that it's particularly dangerous, because percentage-wise, probably it's still safer to be on a bus than to be driving on the streets of Israel. I mean, that has to do more with Israeli driving. But it's not the same. The reaction when a double bus is hit and there's 20 to 40 dead and hundreds of casualties, it's completely different. But nevertheless, there are people that go on with their lives 100%. There's all sorts of index to the Intifada. One is called the Plastic Surgery Index. And plastic surgeons
What
have
is that?
noted that when the Intifada started, there was a huge drop-off, that people couldn't see how they could justify fixing their nose or their cheeks or their whatever needed beautifying in the midst of all this horror. Today, it's back up to pre-Intifada levels, meaning that people have somehow come to terms with this. There's a hope and a prayer that we will have a peaceful outcome, and there are examples all over Israel that promise a peaceful outcome, in a sense. But the bottom line is that people have returned to a normal life, except that there are very abnormal things, such as an alarm going off or an ambulance. If you hear an ambulance here, it's usually the police chasing someone or someone being brought to a hospital, and no one thinks twice more than move your car over.
Right.
That's it. In Israel, you hear an ambulance, everything freezes.
Really?
Everybody waits for a radio, a TV, where's the attack, how many, what's the story.
Sure. And every high
then they
school
get-
child, every person
Yes.
has a cell phone.
And then they start calling on the cell phones. Is everybody all right? Check with their husbands, check with their wives, check with their children. Check everybody to make sure everybody's okay. And the cell phones, are full-time busy whenever there's any, attack
Well, listen,
anywhere in the country.
I think that it's amazing for us as Americans to look and see how Israelis can continue a regular lifestyle in the midst of all of that terror, because it's wartime. There's no question about it. I mean, it's as if you'd be in the middle of wartime. God forbid, and I say that 10 times over, that we should ever have any type of suicide bombing here in our shores. I mean, beside or after 9/11 or anything, somebody going into a supermarket, someone going into a pizza place, or in the subways or anything like this. These are nightmares to us, and the idea of it happening over and over again, it just would change the whole psyche of America to such a great degree. As much as 9/11 changed our psyche, this kind of constant bombardment would change it. You said something also I want to go back to. You said that there are signs and hopes of peace that you see in Israel. Can you go into that for us a little bit?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think, first of all, there's examples for when I visit towns. My business takes me to every section of the country. Nazareth Elite was a town built next to Nazareth, which is an Arab town mixed between Arab Christians and Muslims. And Nazareth Elite was built on the neighboring mountain to be mostly a Jewish town. Today, they overbuilt the apartments in Nazareth Elite, and many of the buyers are Arabs whose families have expanded from Nazareth. And the town today is a very complete mixture of immigrants from Russia and immigrants from Eastern Europe, Ashkenazi Jews, Jews from Eastern Europe and various sections, and native-born Israelis who are all living together. And there, to my knowledge, there's never been any sort of violence, no terrorist attacks, no violence that has ever been Arab versus Jew in that neighborhood.
This is a very important point, because many people are unaware of the fact that for hundreds and hundreds of years, Jews and Arabs have lived side by side with a tremendous sense of peace and security and respect, the one for the other as distant cousins in a certain degree. And what's happened recently is just the total exploitation of a political situation by much of the leadership, particularly as I believe in the Arab area, to focus attention away from some of the problems that are going on within the Arab world, and just make the Jew, make Israel the villain for all of our problems, for everything that's going on. And the world has piled billions of dollars in there. How much, or what percentage of it has actually gotten to the streets of the Palestinian people? Very, very little. It's because they want to keep them poor. They want to keep them victimized. They want to keep them in a situation where we can constantly point a finger and say, this is the Israelis' fault. The amount of money that they've received is just, would have totally transformed the society already.
Absolutely. What I pointed out in the book is that the institutions involved in supposedly resolving the dispute, including the United Nations and currently the Quartet, but different governments have come in, such as the United States government as negotiator, have consistently failed to find the resolution, partially because Arab leadership came from the original terrorist group of the Palestinian, the PLO, which has never given up its dream of liberating the entire Palestine, which they include the land of Israel, the state of Israel. And their demands have been such as right of return is nothing more than a euphemism of putting millions of Arabs, currently the estimate is 5 million Arabs, Palestinian Arabs throughout the world, into the land of Israel to demographically outnumber the number of Jews in the area and say a single state from the Jordan to Mediterranean and call it Palestine. And that's their solution, both politically, socially, and they see it as a historical venture that will be fulfilled.
That's part of the destiny, right.
So against that is...
But there's no talking. If that's,
there's no talking to them.
There's nothing to discuss. If that's going to be an uncompromisable type of goal, then there's nothing to discuss.
And there's no president of the United States, no president of Russia, or no UN resolution that will satisfy that kind of outlook short of the elimination of the state of Israel.
And how do you explain that mentality? How do you explain that Arab viewpoint to an American audience so that they're able to understand that the Arabs do look at this with a very fervent religious intent behind it, that this is something that is part of their belief system, that this is the way it's going to be. And even amongst some moderate Arab professors. I've heard from many of them statements which you would expect from a moderate. You'd get more of a compromising type of viewpoint, but you get that as a matter of fact, that this is just part of the Arab view.
Well, included in the book is quotes from and letters from others such as Bibi Netanyahu and Livnat, educational minister in Israel, and some others, that indicate that the conflict is not about who controls the Temple Mount or how many refugees are allowed to resettle in the land of Israel or any particular political issue which sits on the table as a point of departure between the two sides. In fact, the dispute is a dispute between an interpretation of Islam that says jihad means the destruction of any non-Muslim or the removal of the sovereignty of any non-Muslim leadership and the replacement by a Muslim state, in fact. Whereas Muslims who live in London or in other countries, Malaysia and Indonesia and many other parts of the world, interpret jihad in a different way. And if the extremists or fanatics, if you will, are successful in saying the proper interpretation is violent overthrow of non-Muslim institutions and non-Muslim states, then Israel will be only the first victim of a greater Muslim tide to really destroy Western society. And that's what bin Laden's about, and that's what Arafat's about, and that's what some of the Arab leadership is trying to pursue.
Interesting.
And it's a cultural battle that has to be fought, both politically, economically, socially, and educationally. The sin of Oslo, from my point of view, is that there was never anything in Oslo that said peace has to be taught to every Palestinian. Israelis assumed that and started teaching peace lessons from the day Oslo was signed until the start of the Second Intifada, and only now they're starting to reconsider whether that's the best thing to be teaching the Israeli kids in the schools. But peace and coexistence was the primary curriculum in modern Israeli history from the time 92 right through
the
current day.
Tell me, I know you've done some speaking about the book. What kind of reactions have you gotten from the American audience?
Well, again, the American audience is aware that we have a war against terror. I don't think they appreciate how dangerously close that war is to arriving on our shores. 9/11 was a single incident, and now as that we're moving past it, as it's now becoming anniversaries of 9/11, we look at it and say, our daily lives are not changed that much. It takes longer to get on a plane, it takes longer to do other things, we have security checks, but we don't live with the kind of fear that you mentioned earlier, that Israelis have, that every aspect of their life can be upset by terrorist attacks.
Do you feel, I mean, without making any predictions, do you feel that we're just seeing the beginning of a wave of terror that the future holds?
It depends on the commitment of the United States and then other countries who will join in the war on terror to see in their own interest to actively work. The allies in this war are not the ones you're thinking of. For example, Muslim fundamentalism is very strong in Algeria. Algeria has thousands of casualties in their war against terror, but it doesn't make the news. No reporters that I know have gone to Algiers, interviewed Algerian ministers to ask them how are they handling and what they're doing about it. And yet it's a very active daily battle in Algiers.
I haven't even heard about it.
And the epilogue of this book cites that this war is being fought in India, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in other places.
Countries wherever there are Muslims located. There's always there seems to be a cell or a core that's dedicated to this purpose. Tell me, we're coming to a close, but I want to know, you've spoken to children, I'm sure, about this, perhaps your own children, young children in Israel. What goes through their heart? What goes through their mind? How do children handle this type of constant fear?
Okay, that's a very good question. And I have a feeling, I hope I'm not depressing, but I think Israeli children are victims in the hundreds of thousands. They're victims because they're upset by what they see. They don't have to be killed on a bus to be caught in the middle of a situation, to have relatives, to have friends, to be going to funerals at a very young age, and to some extent, many of them are losing their childhood.
They're living with death on a daily basis. They're seeing things that children
Right.
shouldn't be seeing.
Exactly. And I have fears that it'll be much harder for them to grow up with the kind of, I hate to say liberalism, but Americans feel that we should be peaceful and cooperative and with everyone in the world. We want to be friends with everyone. We want pluralistic societies
Right.
where everyone lives in peace. And it's much harder to do that when your childhood's been robbed, when your family members have been murdered, and the violence is all around you.
What is the reaction in Israel to the strong support that the Christian right here in America has been rallying behind Israel with?
Well,
Is it well publicized in Israel?
to a certain extent, yes. It's a bit strange to find that Christian right are more pro-Israel than many of the Jews living in America, and yet that seems to be the reality today, that those in the Christian right have made the kind of statements and the kind of support
Fortunately,
that
there's a step
Israelis
forward.
are looking for.
Right.
On the other hand, from an Israeli point of view, one thing you touched on as well is that many Israelis are turning inward and saying, this is the land of miracles, this is the land that biblically is the Jewish homeland, and they're depending on the Almighty to provide the answer and become more religious in their personal lives.
I think that's really what it comes down to, is the Almighty is the one in charge, and
Right.
we're in God's hands, and this is part of
Exactly.
Israel's destiny, and we don't know what is planned, but we're confident that it will be something hopefully good.
Thanks.
God willing. Listen, I want to thank you again, and if anybody's interested in getting this book, they can get it at Borders, I believe, or Amazon.com
Amazon.com and Barnes & Noble.
and Barnes & Noble. And is there a phone number they can call if they'd like to order the book?
Yes, they can also order from area code 516-642-1232.
Okay, can you
That's the
repeat that once
publisher.
again?
That's area 516-642-1232. That's MS Finan Publishers.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stern, I wish you a lot of success with the book,
Thank
and I
you.
hope that your time in Israel will be successful and continue
peaceful.
and peaceful. That's the most
Thank
important.
you.
We should have long-term peace. Meantime, I want to just say that we have to really stand by our brethren. As much as they're afraid, though, we need to go there to visit. We need to go there to be able to support them, to show them that we're there with them side by side, ready to go on the buses, to do what needs to be done, to show them that we're there in our heart and our soul. Very, very important. Meantime, I'll see you next week for the Jewish Spotlight. Same time, same station. Shalom.
Hey, don't be a man, you know, he ain't who for. You're going to be